good morning to those of you guys joining us from the US, and good evening to those of you in China. And hello from people that I know that are joining from other places in the world as well. My name is Devin Lau, and I am the Assistant Director for Yale Center Beijing. Today, we are very happy to host Professor Emma Zang to participate in a very fascinating discussion on gender-neutral public policies and their consequences in China. We're very excited to have her and excited to be having such a fascinating discussion. Couple housekeeping notes: if people are able to and willing to turn on their video cameras, that is always appreciated. We, at least in the US, still are not completely opened up, and so we always like to see faces when we can, even if it is through Zoom, just because it's always good to be talking to a person and not just a blank screen. So for those of you guys that are able to, please go ahead and turn on your video cameras, especially during the talk and the Q&A session. And I know that some of you guys may be new to our talk series, so let me just introduce Yale Center Beijing real quick. Yale Center Beijing was established in 2014 as Yale's only university-wide center outside of New Haven, of course. And we have been hosting talks and activities in Beijing for many years, spanning all 14 of Yale's different schools. And during the pandemic, we've been able to transition onto Zoom, and we've had many professors from across the fields joining us on everything from the arts to biology to economics to philosophy. And so today we're very lucky to have Professor Emma Zang join us for a talk on sociology. Professor Emma Zang is an assistant professor of sociology at Yale, where she's also a faculty fellow of the Yale Institution for Social and Policy Studies, and she's also a Butler Williams Scholar at the U.S. National Institute of Aging. She earned her PhD from Duke, and her research focuses on family demography and population health, both in China and the U.S. And so her work has been recognized through numerous awards, including the Chinese Government Award for Outstanding Self-Financed Students Abroad from the China Scholarship Council, which we are particularly delighted to highlight because we've been starting a new series highlighting professors who have studied both in China and the US and are now teaching at Yale. And so this is very exciting to have her join us as well. Her research, of course, is quite popular and has been reported by many major media outlets in the US, China, and elsewhere around the world, including CNN, NBC, BBC, Washington Post, Harvard Business Review, etc. So very well accomplished, and I guess I would say up and coming scholar, but I think she's already made it. So, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Zang and have her start her talk, and then we'll move into a Q&A after that.
Okay, thank you so much, Devin, for the nice introduction and for inviting me to this talk. Hello, everyone. Now I will talk for about like 30 minutes, and then we can open to Q&A section. Let me share my slides right now. Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As the introduction in the talk says, in China, most family and aging policies are gender blind and are often framed as gender neutral. Today, I will talk about how these seemingly gender neutral policies can have gendered consequences. Because of limited time, I will only focus on one specific policy today, but in the Q&A section, we can also talk about other relevant policies. Before talking about policies, let me try to convince you why we should care about gender equality. This is important because if you don't think gender equality matters, it is unclear why we should care about the gendered consequences of social policies. If you are a woman, it may be natural for you to care about women's rights and gender equality, but if you are a man, why should you care about it? Okay, let me give it a try. First, I believe for most men, there are at least several important women in your life. For example, your mother, and if you are lucky, you may also have a wife. Some of you may also have daughters and sisters. You love them, so you care about them. You care about whether they are treated fairly. Second, There is a disproportionate number of women living in poverty in less developed regions in China, where they cannot compete for jobs. Improving gender equality by reducing female poverty rates could substantially reduce overall poverty in China. From a nation's perspective, you can view these efforts on reducing gender inequality as targeted interventions. Third, research has shown that structural sexism harms both men's and women's health. Structural sexism means systematic gender inequality in power and resources. For example, gender-biased social norms and public policies are examples of structural sexism. In a recent paper published in the American Sociological Review, as this figure illustrates, researchers found that patriarchal social systems foster a toxic culture that harms men as well as women. For example, in patriarchal societies, men are often engaged in risky health behaviors that signify masculinity, such as smoking, drinking, fighting with others physically, and are more reluctant to seek mental health therapy when they need it. Okay, so hopefully you are convinced now that gender equality is important. Then the next question is how China is doing in terms of gender equality. As China has gotten richer, many people expected that the gender inequality situation would improve. But if we compare China with other countries in the world using the Global Gender Gap Index, China ranked in just the 45th percentile in gender equality in 2006 and has continued to regress over the past decade. In 2016, China fell all the way down to the 31st percentile, and this is still the ranking today in 2021. Aggregate statistics also tell us that Chinese women are disadvantaged compared to Chinese men in almost all aspects, including income, education, employment, occupation, health, and more. Most people are certain that this kind of macro-level gender inequality is bad. However, many people become uncertain about whether gender inequality within the household, such as between the husband and the wife, is such a bad thing. Intra-household gender inequality has existed in China for thousands of years. Many people, including Chinese policymakers, tend to view this inequality as a Chinese tradition rather than a pressing social issue. According to a survey conducted by the Chinese government in 2010, not only Chinese men but also Chinese women increasingly believe that men should take care of things outside of the household, whereas women should take care of things within the household. Okay, so hopefully now you are convinced that gender inequality is a pressing social issue in China. Then we can talk about what we should do. To achieve gender equality, we need some good policies. But most existing social policies in China are gender blind, meaning that they disregard gender as a significant factor in social interactions. For example, in laws and policies, it is common to see the gender-blind phrase, a reasonable person, even in those related to sexual harassment, for which the majority of the victims are women. These kind of gender-blind policies are often framed as gender-neutral. Gender-neutral here means that the policies are not aimed specifically at either men or women and are assumed to affect both sexes equally. Is this really the case? Today, I will use the 2011 judicial interpretation of the marriage law in China to show you that these seemingly gender-neutral policies can have severe gendered consequences in the Chinese social context. This figure shows the accrued marriage rates in China from 1978 to 2016. The marriage rate has been fluctuating throughout the whole period, and we do not see a very clear pattern. Now let's look at the divorce rate. The divorce rate in China has been increasing steadily over time. By 2016, the accrued divorce rate had increased to 3 divorces per 1,000 persons. This number is very similar to the rate for the United States in the same year. As divorce has become more common, divorce-related legislation has become more important to intra-household property rights. Since the establishment of the new China, the divorce law has been modified several times. The dotted vertical lines represent significant changes of the divorce laws. I'm happy to address these changes more in the Q&A section. But simply speaking, before 2011, the divorce law was modified to follow the trend of promoting women's rights. In particular, the family home was generally considered joint property upon divorce. In 2011, the Chinese Supreme Court changed the divorce law by stipulating that the family home belongs to the registered owner upon divorce. What does this mean? Simply speaking, for a Chinese household where only the husband's name was on the deed of the family home, before the legal change in 2011, the family home was considered joint property upon divorce. After the legal change in 2011, the family home belonged to the husband upon divorce. This amounts to transferring property rights from women to their husbands within the marriage. This legal change has generated a lot of controversy since it was announced. Some argue that the legal change is fair and gender neutral, but others believe it is unfair to women. There have been many reports by Chinese media outlets about this legal change. According to these reports, this is arguably the most controversial divorce law since the establishment of the new China. Numerous discussions on Chinese social media also raised the awareness of this legal change among the general public. So I believe it is not an exaggeration to say that this legal change is well known. Even major international media outlets have devoted pages to reporting this legal change. Let's look at one example here from the New York Times in the right corner. The title is Chinese Law Could Make Divorced Women Homeless. To understand why this policy could negatively affect women, it helps to have some background knowledge about Chinese marriage norms and traditions and housing. In the Chinese tradition, men are considered the heads of the household. The patriarchal features of Chinese society have shaped the bride price practice on the marriage market. In this practice, a woman marries into a man's family and joins a new household. The groom's family is expected to provide the family home as a precondition for marriage in order to gain the approval of the bride's family. As the cartoon shows, men without homes often have a difficult time finding a wife. The patriarchal society has also led to the development of a son preference, which has led to a shortage of women on the marriage market, and therefore reinforced the bride price practice. Because of this marriage tradition, Chinese parents typically only help their sons purchase family homes before marriage, but not their daughters. For this reason, the majority of the family homes in China were only registered under the name of the husband. However, as the housing price in China increased at a rate of 10% per year since the early 2000s, many men could not afford the family home anymore. As a result, women often chipped in to help their husbands with the purchase, but their names were rarely on the deed. Moreover, although women are not expected to provide the family home, they are expected to furnish the home, take care of children as the elderly, and contribute the majority of housework. None of these efforts were valued by the Chinese Supreme Court. So why did China launch such a controversial law in 2011? There are four socioeconomic forces behind this legal change. First, as Chinese people become richer, there was a strong legal need to protect personal property. As a result, China passed its first property law in 2007. Second, the housing price has been increasing at a rate of 10% per year since the early 2000s. Therefore, the husband's birth family typically spend a large portion of their household wealth to purchase a family home. At the same time, the divorce rate in China has been increasing dramatically. The husband's birth family increasingly faced the potential of losing a large share of household wealth upon their son's divorce, which they felt unfair. Finally, social media began to play an important role in supervising the government's actions. Similar cases resulting in conflicting court rulings tended to generate a lot of controversy on the internet, which subsequently harmed the government's credibility. There was a need for the court to have a divorce law that was clear, simple, specific, and was consistent with the spirit of the property law launched in 2007 to reduce flexibilities of judges' rulings. As a result, the 2011 divorce law was enacted. If you think about the broader picture here, the launch of the new judicial interpretation reflects and signals a conservative turn of gender norms in China. The new judicial interpretation protects private property along the patrilineal line, which further strengthens the notion of property sharing within the birth family and weakens the notion of property sharing within the marital family. It discourages women from getting a divorce through threatening them with loss of property. Family in China is closely tied to the dominant patriarchal ideologies and plays a fundamental role in maintaining the social order of the patriarchal society. In the era of rising divorce rates, a series of efforts have been made by the state towards strengthening the family and controlling rising divorce rates. The new judicial interpretation, along with these recent efforts, can be seen as a response of the state to the change of marriage as a social institution. Well, some people may say these are just speculations. Maybe in real life, there are no such consequences. In order to empirically examine the effect of the 2011 judicial interpretation, I conducted a study which was published in the Journal of Marriage and Family in 2020. In this study, I used data from the China Family Panel Studies, which is a nationally representative sample. Using this data, I was able to track 22,544 married individuals before and after the legal change. I examined the effect of the legal change on the following outcomes for men and women separately: divorce risks, subjective well-being, work hours, housework hours, and confidence about the future. I found that for a typical Chinese household where only the husband's name was on the deed of the family home before the legal change, the 2011 judicial interpretation reduced married couples' divorce risks, decreased women's subjective well-being and confidence about the future within 1 year after the legal change, increased working hours on paid market jobs within 1 year after the legal change, and increased housework hours in the long term. Note here that because of data limitations, I was only able to examine housework in 2014 and later years, so I was now able to examine housework in 2012. By contrast, no effects were found for men's outcomes. How should we explain these findings? Basically, we can say that the legal change may have incentivized women to stay in unhappy marriages by increasing the cost of divorce for them. They were less happier, less confident about the future, and they're doing more housework in the long term. At the same time, they are also working more. But we don't see any significant effects on men. Basically, men were not affected that much by the legal change. Okay, so let's look at just one outcome, subjective well-being, in detail to further understand these findings. To examine the causal effect, I adopted a quasi-experimental approach. There are a lot of technical details behind these statistics. The idea behind this strategy, though, is very intuitive. So the broad idea is that we have a treatment group and a control group. For the treatment group, property rights are transferred from the wife to the husband because of the legal change. For the control group, there are no changes in property rights related to this policy. We observe them both before and after the law went into effect. We assume that in the absence of the legal change, the well-being patterns of the two groups would have been parallel. then we can view the trend of the control group as a counterfactual of that of the treatment group. The difference between the observed trend and of the treatment group and the counterfactual trend is the treatment effect of interest. I constructed treatment and control groups based on individual home ownership. There are 4 situations in terms of home ownership. First, only the husband's name is on the deed. Second, both names are on the deed. Third, neither name is on the deed. And finally, only the wife's name is on the deed. Most of the individuals in the third category live in rental homes, as we can see from the distribution of these categories. Indeed, most married individuals in China live in households where only the husband's name is on the deed. The first group is the treatment group because property rights was transferred from women to their husbands after the legal change. The second and third groups are the control group because the legal change should not have affected them due to the equal home ownership statuses between men and women. The last group is excluded from the main analysis. This figure shows the results for men. The gray line here indicates the timing of the legal change, and the y-axis is subjective well-being. As we can see, the treatment group is always happier than the control group. The trends for subjective well-being between these two groups are parallel, before and after the legal change, indicating no effects of the legal change in 2011. Now let's look at the results for women. Before the legal change, the treatment group was happier than the control group. However, within a year after the legal change, the subjective well-being for the treatment group dropped more substantially compared to the control group, indicating a negative effect of the legal change on women's subjective well-being. However, this effect seemed to have weakened later on as we see the treatment group was happier than the control group again in 2014 and 2016. So what happened? Why did the effect weaken later on? I found some evidence that couples may have arranged to abide by a more traditional Chinese marriage norm after the reform. The traditional Chinese marriage norm here is that the husband provides family home and shares it with the wife. Specifically, many men in the treatment group transfer property rights to their children. And this is a rather unique finding in the Chinese context compared to many other Western countries. By 2016, 9.1% of the individuals in the treatment group added the wife's name to the deed of the family home. 29.5% of them transferred ownership to their children, and 3.2% of them transferred ownership to the wife. In total, approximately 42% of individuals in the treatment group have changed property ownership status within 5 years of the legal change. This figure shows the proportions of individuals in the treatment and control groups over time. As we can see, there is a big decrease in the proportions of individuals in the treatment group in 2014. Because the law was passed in August in 2011, the 2012 wave is likely too soon for families to adjust. We see the decrease in the proportions of individuals in the treatment group is small between 2010 and 2012. Hopefully now I have convinced you that the 2011 judicial interpretation, although was considered gender neutral by many people, including some Chinese policymakers, has some gendered consequences. Back to our question of how we can achieve gender equality. Apparently, gender-blind policies often won't work. Gender-blind policies, though they may appear to be unbiased, are often, in fact, based on information derived from men's activities and the assumption that all persons affected by the policies have the same needs and interests as males. In contrast to gender-blind policies, gender-sensitive policies take gender relations into account. The WHO, the United Nations and WHO describe 3 types of gender-sensitive policies: gender-neutral policies, gender-specific policies, and gender redistributive policies. As we mentioned before, gender-neutral policies are not aimed specifically at either men or women and are assumed to affect both sexes equally. Gender-specific policies acknowledge that women's gender-related needs have been neglected in the past, and the goal of such policies is to identify specific strategies that are appropriate for women. The goal of gender redistributive policies is to rebalance the power structure to create a more balanced relationship between men and women. That is, they really target on reducing the structural sexism. Depending on specific policy goals, each of these three types of gender-sensitive policies may have its unique advantages. Okay, I'll stop it here. Thank you all for listening and look forward to the Q&A session.
All right, great. Thank you so much. So now we're going to transition into a time of Q&A. So anybody that has questions, feel free to use the chat box to either mention your question, or you can raise your hand under the participants area. There should be a raise hand function, and I will be able to call on whoever has questions. We have a question in the chat box asking about the sampling. Is the sampling robust? But I guess you can talk a little bit more about just sort of methodology in general and how you came about your study.
Yeah, thank you. The sample is conducted by Peking University, and it's a nationally representative sample using probabilistic sampling method. So there are a lot of technical justifications online about this data set. So in general, I would say this is one of the best quality data set in China. It tracks a lot of people over time. So I would say, yeah, the sampling is pretty robust.
All right, we have a very interesting, so you mentioned that because of time, we're only discussing one particular case, but of course, I think for people that are asking questions, feel free to ask about others related potentially gendered policies as well. And so Carol asks something that I think a lot of people have been thinking about in regards to the three-child policy. That's something that's been in the news recently. And how you think traditions and regulations will interact to change people's lives in regards to the three-child policy.
Oh, this is such an interesting question. Well, we don't have any empirical evidence on this for now, but I think it's not surprising women will be expected to have more children in the future. I'm not sure they will actually have a third child, but at least they will be expected to have those. As a young woman myself, and I'm sure a lot of young women in China have the same struggle, that is how to balance career and family. Based on empirical research, the most consistent finding about women's career and family is that there's a motherhood penalty. And if you plot women's wage trajectories over time, it's basically pretty similar to men's wage trajectories until you have your first child. And then your wage will drop substantially, and they will never come back to the original level. Think about having this process 3 times, right? So I think apparently one consequence that young women, particularly, they would be having a lot of mental pressure. Think about whether they should have a second or third child, and whether they should get married at all. And then there will be a lot of negotiations within the family, and depending on who has more bargaining power in the family. In China, I would think a lot of men, they're still the breadwinners, they're still the heads of households. Also, the parents-in-laws, they have a lot of power too, particularly if you live in a house where only the husband's name is on the deed, as we talk about the divorce law change. So I would imagine a lot of women would be pressured to have more children, and therefore their career will be further disrupted. So that I think that's one obvious consequence that we can imagine. So in this case, it's another very good example, the third child policy, right? They didn't say, well, women and men, but only women can give birth to children, right? So apparently the consequences cannot be gender neutral.
Great. And I guess since we're already talking about different policies and how they affect potentially have gendered consequences, what are some other, if we had more time, what are some other policies that you think would be most important to address, and maybe even some of the more surprising ones that people wouldn't normally think of as having gendered consequences?
Yeah, this is such an important question. So I think so far we haven't had a lot of policies on sexual harassment, and there are actually a lot of practice in the Western countries. So sexual harassment originally, even in Western policies, they use like a reasonable person in the law or policies. But based on the data, the majority of the victims of sexual harassment is actually women. So by using this kind of gender blind languages, they kind of disregard the role of gender and making the policy less targeted on women. So if this kind of policy could be gender sensitive, and then we can do a better job reducing sexual harassment incidences by better addressing women's needs and their special roles and expectations in the society. So this is one example. I also would like to talk about this another example, which I have done some research on the legal retirement ages in China. Well, that issue is more complicated in a way that is not gender blind. So that would be one example among the Chinese policies that is more gender specific. So the legal retirement ages in China are a little bit complicated. But generally speaking, among urban residents, the legal retirement age for men is age 60. Well, the legal retirement age for women is age 50. But if you are like a female cadres, you can retire at age 55. But a lot of women actually retire at age 50. So one interesting question is why like men and women's legal retirement ages are different in China, whereas they are the same in many other countries. Well, this has not been very well studied, but there are some like potential guesses. So one potential guess about the motivation of making the law like gender specific is that the policymakers believe that women are weaker physically because they have to take care of family, they have to give birth to children. So they view this kind of like earlier retirement ages as a protection for women, so that they can start to collect pension earlier. So another potential reason, which is also plausible, is the policymakers would like the women to retire early so that they can take care of grandchildren. So that it's another like a consideration to kind of like help the family function as young women have to work. So these are hypotheses, and I examine basically the spillover effect of men's retirement on women's health in China. So because in China, most couples, men are a little bit older, but they're not that older. So their age difference would be like wouldn't be 10 years apart. So in most families, actually, the women retire first, and then men retire later. And in the Asian studies, consistent evidence show that, well, if women retire earlier and the men retire later, then men's retirement would actually benefit the couple's health and happiness. But it's not the case if the men retire earlier and women has to work when the men have retired. Then the divorce risks increase substantially, and men's retirement typically will have some negative consequences. Why? The many reasons were like if the men retire earlier, because women typically do most of the housework, they still need to take care of the men, and then they still need to balance family and career. Whereas if women retire early, they have more time, so men are happier, so the family are happier. So because of this gender difference in the legal retirement ages, so in the Chinese household, we see a lot of couples, like women retire early and men retire later. And I do find men's retirement benefits women's health. I find that after men's retirement, now like both couples retire, right? So they spend more time doing plaza dancing and visiting friends, all those kind of fun things. So that's a very interesting example among Chinese policies that is gender specific.
That's very interesting. We can discuss more about that in a bit. There's another question or a follow-up question in the chat box regarding research methods, which I know many people who are on this call are aspiring academics and interested in sociology. And so there was a question about your research methods again regarding quantitative versus qualitative, whether you use any qualitative research as well. And the impetus behind the question is obviously with China being such a large country and sampling being difficult for various reasons. And so just sort of talking even more in depth about the research methods for this particular study, but I guess also in general, because I know for a lot of people, it's a changing landscape for doing research about China as well.
Yeah, definitely. So I use quantitative methods most of the for the majority of the analysis. I have been like just talking to some people just to get a better sense about this topic and people's like real life feelings. I talked to a couple of lawyers in China just to ask them like how in practice this law was enforced. But for the study, the majority of the analysis are quantitative. So I use this natural experimental approach. I introduced a little bit in the talk. It is one type of econometric analysis. Yeah, the publication, I have the paper published in the journal Marriage and Family in 2020. So if you look at my personal website on my CV, you can easily find it. I can also share a link in the chat. For the sampling, I agree that sampling in China is difficult because China is huge, right? And it's very complicated. I think one strength of my study is that I actually didn't sample these people by myself. Instead, I rely on a like very high quality data set collected by Peking University, and they spend like millions of dollars on this survey. They have professionals who conduct surveys, and they have a lot of detailed technical reports about the quality of this survey. And from the report, simply speaking, the survey is representative of the majority of Chinese provinces, except for I think Tibet and Xinjiang. So I would say this is pretty high quality, and it's probabilistic sampling, meaning that it's truly representative. To further illustrate that, just in case there are some students here, so what is a probabilistic sampling method? So if you want to, for example, conduct a study about, we have 44 people in this room, right? So we have, if you 45 now. If you want to conduct like a study on 45 people in this room, and you don't have that much money and time to sample every one of them, so you could randomly pick maybe like Devin, me, and then that would be super biased because we're the host. Or you could use some probability theory to make sure you sample maybe 10 people, but this 10 people represent a cluster of people with a certain characteristics, so that we make sure that each broader type of individual has some representation in our data. So that is the general idea about this survey.
Great, thanks. So I know we're flip-flopping between research methods and content, but Alex has an interesting question. So the question is regarding the phenomenon of entrance exams, Gaokao scores of male and female students in public security colleges and how they're different. And do you think there is a certain rationality for why they're different and how they're treated differently as well?
I really like this question. Yeah, this is another policy. Actually, I think it's not well, it's gender blind, right? It's because Gaokao is the same for male and female students. The cutoff scores are the same. However, I have heard some recent discussions about changing it to gender specific, but it's not like trying to lower women's cutoff score or something. It's trying to like make it higher. The idea about it is Chinese women's academic performance in recent years has surpassed men's. And then some parents and policymakers, they think it's good to maintain a balanced sex ratio in like elite colleges or higher education. So they want to protect those boys in this way, so by lowering their cutoff scores. That sounds very controversial, right? But they have some justifications. I would love to hear about the audience thoughts on this. So the justification is that the questions asked in college entrance examinations heavily depend on memorization, and women are better at memorizing things than men. So in other words, they believe that text questions are typically biased against men. So that's their justification for lowering the cutoff scores for men. I personally, I think, I agree. A lot of the test questions in Gaokao are kind of heavily dependent on memorization. And there is some empirical evidence showing that women are better at memorizing things than men. I think this is a super interesting question. I'm not sure like lowering like men's cutoff scores in Gaokao would be the best way to restore a balanced gender ratio. Or I think a further question is whether we should care about the balanced gender ratio in elite colleges in China, rather than considering other things like maybe racial diversity or ethnic diversity, this kind of thing, or diversity based on socioeconomic status. Yeah, if any audience want to jump in, I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, that's a great thing for people to be able to jump in, and because I'm sure everybody has been thinking about it and is affected by it. So if people want to jump in with comments or questions about that, please go ahead and raise your hand or share thoughts on the chat box. While people are doing that, I guess one of the things that you sort of discuss is the unintended consequences, or the of a lot of these policies, right? So if we use the Gaokao thing that we just discussed, if we were to implement something like that, what perhaps are some of the non-intended consequences that people are not seeing when it applies to gender? Because I could see, there. I mean, as you mentioned, there is some empirical evidence for women performing better on memorative tasks and standardized tests in general. But that must have implications for distribution of students, and perhaps if you look down the line, if we talk about left behind, men or women. So I'm just curious what you think with your experience studying gender. What would be some of the potential unintended consequences of something like that?
So if Devin, I understand correctly, your question is if we implement the policy that lowers the cutoff score for boys, what are the unintended consequences? I actually honestly don't know. So I think I could say both ways. I could say that women working harder, and I mean lowering the cutoff scores may provide a bad incentive for boys. Thinking about that now, they need to work less harder in order to get into the same college as women. And then another interesting consequence might be on the marriage market. And then if that's the case, let's assume that in the same college, right? Like women, they have higher academic ability compared to men because they have higher cutoff scores. So it's harder for them to enter these elite colleges. So on average, their academic performance is better than men. And then they would on the marriage market, we will face a lot of men and women with the same educational attainment, but their academic performance is different. So I think that would be a very interesting phenomenon, just to think about it, and whether within the marriage, women will have like higher bargaining power, just because let's say maybe they're smarter or something. Another thing, I think like the current standardized test, which heavily depends on memorization, there's some like disadvantages about that, but I don't think it is such a bad thing, to be honest. I mean, currently these days in China, because what you see in the US, for example, it's more complicated to get into college. So you not only need like SAT score, you also need recommendation letters. You also need to do some volunteer work, right? You need to make your CV like very, very fancy in a way that you are not only a person who cares about study, but also you have like bigger visions towards the world. I'm sure like most Yale students are familiar with that. So I have some students at Yale that they have to study very hard during the day, and then at night they still need to got into a lot of extracurriculum activities, and as a result they sleep very little. And this is all great, but think about China. We have so many students and so few schools. It's kind of like very difficult to have the same system as the US has. Basically, we don't have enough like resources to view this kind of materials so carefully. And also preparing all these materials will give Chinese parents additional burden. Just think about for a person from like a very underdeveloped regions in China, they can memorize things. If they work very hard, if they just spend tons of hours trying to memorize every details in the textbook, they can get into college. But if you ask them, oh, you have to play violin now, you have to attend this fancy conference internationally, they don't have the resources. So I don't think like the current Gaokao system is that bad, to be honest. But that's just my personal opinion on this.
Great. Althea has a question. What are the possible steps forward for China to adopt more gender equal policies given its rigid stance on progressivism? And can students have an impact on this?
That's a great question. So what are the possible steps? So it's very complicated because the policy making process in China is not that approachable by the general public. But I do think there's something that we can do. So as researchers, like we can conduct more research, and as policymakers, I think we need to promote the culture of adopting evidence-based policy. So this policy cannot be just based on some kind of speculation. So they need to be based on rigorous empirical research with high quality data. And students can definitely have an impact on this by either trying to study research methods to become a researcher, or trying to or get a job in the government and become policymakers yourself. Or just to promote this kind of atmosphere or culture environment in the society.
Great. Sherry has a follow-up question. Sherry, are you able to ask directly, or would you want me to read the question? That's okay. All right, so Sherry's question is a follow-up to regarding recruitment efforts that are different based on gender in education. And then I guess the question being employers potentially favor male job seekers instead of females. And that seems to be a common phenomenon in the job market. So I'm not quite sure what the question is. I guess just comparing the education system and the gender difference between that and the job market. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure the question here is, but I can comment a little bit on this. I think one surprising thing we see in the labor market in China is a lot of job advertisement is gender specific in a bad way. It's gender biased. So for a lot of jobs, they said men only. For a lot of jobs, they said women only. Well, whereas because of some regulations, you are not able to say this happened very often in the US, for example, because it would be considered illegal. You have to make a lot of effort trying to justify why this job is only for men or only for women. But in China, it looks like it's a common practice. So it is an interesting question though. So for example, for the trash man, right? Most of the trash men, the men who pick up the trash, they're men. But is it really necessary to require that men only for this type of job? So there may be some women who are interested in this job and they probably could perform better. Particularly with modern technology, I don't see the reason like why for majority of the jobs that only a specific gender could perform it. Like another example is a nurse, right? Most of the nurses are women, but well, a lot of great nurses they are actually men. Actually, there is a shortage of male nurses. It's also a great career trajectory if any of the audience here are students. If you're a man and you're interested in being a nurse, you can actually have a very good career and very, very good income because it's a huge demand for male nurses.
Great. Wang Haobo, I'm going to unmute you and ask if you want to ask your question directly. No? Okay. I guess I will summarize their question. Basically, the idea is that historically it's been a matrilineal society, and that has mapped onto slow productivity throughout history until recently. It's become recent being 1,000 years ago, patriarchal society, and that has accelerated social civilization's development. So is there some kind of correlation between male, they say hormones, and human progress?
This is such an interesting question. I have never heard about this kind of argument before. I would love to hear more about like the justifications behind this. But I don't think there's a causal relationship personally between having a patriarchal society and a social civilization. I think, well, it's unclear, if most of societies, if they're not patriarchal, and the human societies won't advance. My personal guess is it will still advance. On that said, I do think some of the features of the patriarchal society, maybe not unique to patriarchal society, but it just like they happen to be there, makes like the society more efficient. So that well, a lot of feminists, they were saying that men they like to suppress women in the history, right? So that they can get things done. I don't judge this kind of argument, but I think there's some truth to it. That said, I don't think that we need this feature, which is patriarchal, today anymore, unless like there's a like solid reason for that.
Yeah, a lot of assumptions that need to be parsed out in that theory. So Alicia Berry has a question. Again, I'm going to ask people to unmute if they're able to, but if not, that's fine.
Great. Yeah, I was just interested in what you were just talking about with like the this segregation of occupations, and I was just wondering, because your speciality is policies, so I was just wondering if you think that in China there are policies that could help this, and as well as kind of the educational segregation that then causes the occupational segregation, because obviously these issues are very socially embedded and start at a young age. So yeah, just from a policy perspective, I was wondering if you think that specific policies can help with this.
Yeah, thank you, Alicia. I really appreciate you unmute yourself, and so I feel like talking to a real person. This is such a great question. I think we mentioned this a little bit, such as in the hiring process, right? So a lot of the jobs they are not necessarily only targeting men or women. So I think it's very unnecessary in most cases to have the job advertisement saying these jobs are for men or for women only. But you are definitely right that this is not, well, in order to eliminate this kind of occupational segregation, we need to do something as early as at the school level, in the school stage. So one thing in my own research also, I realized, so I did some study based on parental industry sectors and children's major choices in China using some administrative data from a couple of elite colleges in China. So what we found in the study is really interesting. So we found that well, before 1990s, right, like most of the students in China, they study like STEM. But now, because of the college expansion, a lot more people are allowed to enter colleges, and the additional people that we have in colleges, most of them actually study these new majors, basically humanities and social sciences. So we don't see a substantial increase. We see some increase, but I mean the increase in the number of people attending college, getting college degrees, highly concentrated in humanities and social sciences majors, actually, particularly like economics, laws, this kind of majors. And then if we look at whether their major choices have anything to do with their parents' like occupations or industries, it's actually highly correlated. So one interesting example in our finding is that we found that medical doctors' children are much more likely to attend medical school than any other professions, which is actually highly consistent with Western experience as well. And it's different in the way that in the US or in many Western countries, doctors are actually the most privileged occupations. While in China, doctors are still very privileged, but it's not as privileged, for example, as some other occupations. So another interesting finding is we find that like students from higher socioeconomic status background, they are more likely to study humanities, particularly girls. So if we just look at all the students coming from this high socioeconomic status family, the girls from these families are much more likely to study like Chinese literature or sociology or some other like humanities-oriented subjects. So this is actually a very interesting phenomenon. But in general, we say that girls in China, they're increasingly more likely to study non-STEM majors, where like STEM majors are still disproportionately represented by male students. And we also know in China that the returns to different college majors are huge. Engineers, they make a lot of money right after college, whereas the humanities, social sciences major, they have a much more difficult job market. So I think something could be done trying to promote girls to study the STEM majors. And I believe, the Chinese girls, they're all very smart. I don't believe that they're not good at STEM or at all. So myself is an example. Like I studied sociology back in China in college, and then I thought maybe I was not that interested in STEM, but then I was interested in being a researcher. And then I needed this mathematics, statistics background. So actually, I retook all the mathematics major sequence at Duke as a PhD, and guess what? I nailed it. So I was in this linear regression class, not linear regression, linear algebra classes for engineering majors at Duke. And then I was like the top students, like number 2 in almost all the exams. So I highly believe that for most girls, it's not that STEM majors are that important, that difficult for them. It's just they were told from very young that they're not good at STEM as much as boys. I remember as I growing up, like my father is an engineer, right? He likes to tutor me. And every time I couldn't get something very quickly, he would always say, "Oh, if you were a boy, probably you will get it much more quickly." this is not true, as I proved him to be wrong. And now I'm a very good quantitative researcher, as you can see from the CV. So I think like a lot of policies, a lot of efforts to be done to encourage Chinese girls to study STEM majors.
Great. And I think that's a pretty good note to end on there. Thank you so much, Professor Emma Zang, and thank you everybody for participating. I will ask everybody one more time to unmute if they're able to, so that you guys can all thank Professor personally. And also, if you want to turn on your webcams, we have a tradition of everybody taking a group picture by turning on their webcams.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.